Today I'll show you how I turned this shiny, toy-like N Scale locomotive into a dirty and gritty workhorse like this one that fits right in with the 1960s sport atmosphere of my layout. To me, weathering is not just about making it look dirty or rusty, but is also about giving the model a story and a character. Let's get started. This is VO-1000 by Atlas and N Scale, faithfully created model of the original Baldwin locomotive that are found in service even today after over 80 years of the locomotive been introduced to the market. As you can see in this close-up, there are many details in this tiny model that are screaming to get noticed. I started by looking at the online photos of the real locomotive. Given how popular this locomotive was, there are plenty of examples out there. For a change, I wanted to make a highly weathered locomotive that fits into the harsh environment of a port and shows lack of maintenance, so I chose these PRR locomotives as an example to follow, even though it is not the prototype that I'm building. I start from the side frames. It is best to open them from the trucks, and it is easy with a little patience. No sudden or excessive force, simply keep prying till the clips disengage. Want to know more about how to disassemble N-scale locomotives? Find my loco maintenance video, link in the description below. I'm leaving one pair of side frames intact for now. Black and light gray chalk paint. These are crucial for brush painting models and make life a lot easier. Dry pastels and colored chalk. And finally, Tester's Talcoat lacquer to create a base for the pastel. Oh, I almost forgot. Tester's enamel stains for special effects. Detail and ultra-detail brushes are crucial for success. Hard bristle flat brushes are needed for dry brushing if necessary, and soft, dense makeup brushes will be used to apply the pastel powder. Mix light gray with black to get a medium dark gray shade. Add water to the mix and dilute to about 75%, then start applying on the side frames using a paintbrush. Chalk paint provides a realistic ultra-matte finish that not only takes off all the plasticky shine, but it doesn't leave much brush mark either. It also dries faster than normal acrylic paint. You can see the benefit of opening the part from the locomotive. I don't have to be cautious about getting the paint to wheels or contact strips. If you're not confident about taking off the side frames, you can still paint it without removing it. However, you need to be careful not to let the paint seep behind the side frame and clog the wheels or create an insulating layer on the contacts. You'd also need a smaller brush and work much slower. I used the same gray shade to paint the fuel tank too. Notice that after showing you how to paint the side frames, I've opened it from the trucks, naturally. But why gray? Trucks, side frames and underframes of locomotives are either black or silver right out of the factory. But the black soon starts fading into gray due to constant exposure of dust, grime and crud. I continue with the same color on the frames, the steps, the details of the undercarriage and the pilots. I also made the shiny white handrails look dull with some gray wash. It's time to show you how to make washes at home and apply them easily. I take some black chalk paint on my palette and dilute it about 20%. Then I add a few drops of dishwashing soap and mix well. I take some clean water in a separate container and add a few drops of soap there too. The soap breaks the surface tension, which is crucial for the wash to flow properly. I wet the area where I want to apply the wash with the soap water using a detail brush. Then I take a little wash on my ultra detail brush and just touch it near the crevice that I want to define. The low viscosity of soap water starts acting and most of the pigments flow to the recessed parts. If you're wondering how the wash would have behaved without the soap, here you go. It's nothing but a very light paint that needs to be brushed on and will eventually create a mess in a small N-scale locomotive. Now, if you apply the wash while holding the model in your hand, it is likely that most of the black pigments will settle at the bottom since gravity will eventually pull them down. So, it is a good idea to put the model on a flat surface and then apply the wash. That way, the pigments stay in the gap and don't flow all over the place. I make sure that mostly all nooks and crannies get a little drink of the magic potion. Once the whole area is covered, I let the paint sit for about 10 minutes for water to evaporate and the pigments to settle. Obviously, some pigments will settle on the raised surfaces too. To clean it up, I wet my detail brush in soap water and carefully remove the wash from places where I didn't want them. Notice that when I'm working upside down, I'm pushing the pigments towards the wheel. Just remember how real grime would behave and keep it natural. Notice as the wash dries, the matte finish really gives it a natural look. I found this to be much more effective than enamel washes that leave a shinier finish. In this method, once the wash is dry, it looks like real dust and dirt mixed with grime and diesel exhaust. It's time to do some paint chipping and highlighting. I start with my engineering drawing pencil that has a 0.5mm retractable tip. You don't necessarily need it. You can sharpen a normal HB pencil to a very thin tip, and that should work. The thin lead helped me reach the tiny springs and catch the raised parts on the side frame. Notice how the little shine on the raised parts make those springs visible clearly, yet makes it look natural. The large bolts and bearings got some chipping too. I switch to a standard HB pencil and continue with other areas that are near to the ground and would lose paint easily. The footplits are my favorite. The top parts of the pattern lose paint quickly as people keep walking on them. With this simple trick, you clearly see the pattern even in a small model like this. The graphite gives a subtle metallic shine to the components and makes you believe that the paint has chipped from these areas and then it got a polish over time. I continue with all the edges near the ground, and boy doesn't it make a difference. On the body I use the pencil chipping technique on the handrails, edges of the panels, the handles, the front grille, and the radiator grille on the roof. To simulate paint chipping on broad areas, I rubbed a 6B pencil, then used my finger to blend the graphite to the model. I did this for the side of the cab, a few large panels, and the roof. This is a very powerful technique and it is easy to get carried away, but it is also easy to rectify. Just like the washes, if you overdo it, take a little bit of soap water and clean it up. I covered the entire locomotive with Tester's dull coat lacquer to seal all the work done so far. I'm forced to do this brush-on version because my spray lacquer is over and I cannot get it during the lockdown. Brushing will create a slightly irregular surface, but that might just work out for the battered look that I'm after. We'll know soon. I wanted some additional definition on the side frame, especially the brake shoes and the lower surfaces that often develop a layer of crud and are generally covered with dust and grime. I mixed unbleached titanium, yellow ochre and raw sienna acrylic paints in random proportions and semi-dry brushed on the parts. To create the rust effect, I got my Tester's rust stain. Now, if you don't have it, you can make your homemade wash using raw sienna and that will work perfectly too. The rust pigment settles in the crevices and you can remove any excess using a rolled tip of a paper towel. I start by creating fine dust from the pastel sticks. Simply rub the back of a hobby knife and that makes fine powder. The colors are very simple and straightforward: black, white, flat gray and raw sienna, plus olive brown and reddish brown colored chalk. Starting with the side frames, I used my mica brush to thoroughly apply the random mix of black, gray and white and blend everything to a naturally variant tone. Then I moved to olive brown chalk powder to simulate dust and mix of raw sienna and reddish brown chalk to simulate rust. The rough texture of the chalk paint in the base layer is important for the pastel and chalk to adhere. I made one set of side frames look rustier and older than the other by adding a bit more raw sienna pastel. This adds a story that the other pair of frames are possibly replacements. On the body, I continued with the same method and created random mix of dirt and a little rust. I used white pastels to simulate fading of paint. Any excess was blown off using a drinking straw. I mixed a little bit of blue with black for the roof. Constant exposure to heat turns the metal bluish and the exhaust lifts a black layer. I brushed the radiator and the roof with this bluish-black mix. You see, the ultra-matte finish of the surface created by the lacquer makes it easy for the pastel and chalk to stick. This layer is quite durable unless you rub the model excessively. And even if you do, since the layer underneath is well protected by the lacquer, you can always top it later with more dry pastel if you gradually lose some of the effects. Before putting the side frames back on, I cleaned the gears and the mechanism to get rid of any trace of chalk and pastels. Finally, I take the opportunity to lubricate the gears before assembling the side frames. Next, I take very little oil and grease stain and apply under the bearings and light trace amount on the springs. You cannot have a locomotive on a seaside town without rust. I took some raw sienna and burnt umber on my palette, tore off a small piece of dense sponge, dabbed it on both paints to make a random mix, almost dried it by dabbing it on a piece of hand towel, and then transferred the rest on the model in random patches. Depending on your desire, you can also do some rust streaking, though in my opinion it is unnecessary for such a small model. For the sake of completeness though, I took very little burnt umber and raw sienna on the tip of my semi-wet ultra-detail brush and applied streaking carefully. I chose areas where there is a joint on the body or there are contours that rainwater will find its way to take the accumulated rust downward. Hinges, door handle shafts, edges of the roof, and rivet joints are natural choices. I prefer doing streaking using dry brushing method since it gives finer lines, but in this case the target area is so small, attempting dry brushing would simply take the paint all over the place. Also, the base red tone hides most of the rust anyway, so I kept the rust effect to a minimum. Here are my other scale model and weathering videos where I've shown various techniques of achieving details and adding stories in scale models. My personal favorite is the barge. Keep watching and have fun making miniatures.